Today, inside of a Prague cemetery, there are the remains of thousands of people buried behind the gates. But this cemetery has some incredibly dark secrets linked to World War II. The Dablice Cemetery in the Dablice district of Prague opened in 1914, and there are over 20,000 registered graves there. But during the Second World War, there were many Czech people buried who had been fighting the tyranny of the Nazis inside of their lands, and buried in there are two men who are considered heroic fighters of World War II. Jan Kubis and Josef Gabčík are interred in Dablice Cemetery. These two men were the assassins of Reinhard Heydrich, the infamous Butcher of Prague, and when the Nazis caught up with them, they were killed. These two men brought the death of one man who was considered possibly Hitler's future successor as Führer, but buried alongside them in the same cemetery are the remains of many executed Nazis who were condemned to death at the end of the Second World War, including the Nazi chief of the Order Police, a man responsible for thousands of war crimes and deaths, Kurt Daluege, one of the most powerful men within the Third Reich. But why are the executed Nazis buried alongside former members of the resistance, and those who bravely fought against them to end their tyranny? To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. The cemetery of Dablice is a huge burial place, and today bunches of flowers and candles are placed on some graves by family members who wish to remember and respect their deceased relatives. This graveyard does seem today peaceful and respectful, but there is a dark and disturbing side to it, and this was a place where many people who resisted oppression during and after the Second World War had their remains at times dumped inside of mass graves, and the families of the dead were never notified of their fate. There is shockingly a children's grave site within, and there are specifically 34 graves of babies whose mothers were political prisoners who had been interred inside of communist camps during the 1950s. These children died of thirst and hunger at the hands of the communists, and their corpses were then placed onto the back of a truck without a coffin and were then dumped into a pit. Years later, the true story of this grave was discovered, and the names of the children were discovered too. However, during World War II, this graveyard became the burial place of many people who were victims of the Nazi occupation, and there are also shockingly many executed Nazis who were horrific war criminals buried in Dablice. There are 70 mass graves inside of the cemetery which themselves contain around 14,000 bodies. From 1943, the Czechs who were killed by the Nazis were buried here in large pits. The occupation of Czechoslovakia during the Second World War was brutal and deadly. The Germans annexed the nation following their initial seizure of the Sudetenland, and by 1944 they had taken the whole lot of the nation. During the occupation, over 300,000 citizens and civilians were murdered. Different high-ranking figures inside of the Nazi Party were brought in to keep the nation productive for the German war industry. Czechoslovakia was regarded as the armaments factory of the Third Reich, and different Nazi leaders arrived to impose their reign of terror upon the nation. They wanted to keep the Czechs in submission, so they could continue to make weapons for the Wehrmacht, and with this the population were terrorised. People were executed in public with their bodies strung up from lampposts in the streets, and these were usually those who were suspected of being involved in anti-Nazi resistance. One man who arrived to instigate this was Reinhard Heydrich, the blonde Butcher of Prague, who is remembered today as one of the most evil Nazis. Heydrich would oversee the final solution and the extermination of millions of people. He was made the chief of the Reich Security Main Office, overseeing the Gestapo and other agencies, but was also appointed the protector of Bohemia and Moravia. He was sent to the Czech lands to brutally put down resistance, and he certainly did that. His forces had thousands arrested, many executed using devices such as the guillotine, within the prisons, and they also deported many people to concentration camps. There was a growing underground resistance movement inside of Czech lands, and people knew how dangerous the work was that they were doing, but they wanted to bring down Heydrich, but they knew the price they would pay for this would be huge. Operation Anthropoid was developed, and two British SOE-trained Czech assassins, Josef Gabčík and Jan Kubis, were the pair who attacked Heydrich, who was travelling to work in his Mercedes car on the 27th of May 1942. Initially, the attack did not go too well, as the machine gun Gabčík held jammed, and Kubis threw an anti-tank grenade at Heydrich's car, and despite the Butcher of Prague managing to put up a fight, he would be evacuated to hospital. He died days later within hospital under rather strange circumstances. A huge manhunt was launched against the assassins, and they took shelter in the cathedral of Saints Cyril and Methodius in Prague. The Waffen-SS then laid siege to the church, but they could not take the assassins alive, despite using 750 SS soldiers to take just 2 people. Attempts were made to get them to surrender, but Gabčík had shot himself in the crypt of the cathedral, which had then been flooded with gas. Kubis had been wounded by a grenade and was found unconscious, and it was specifically said of his death that he had tried to use poison on himself but apparently lost consciousness before he could do so. Although he was immediately transferred to hospital, none of the doctor's attempts to keep him alive succeeded. He died within 20 minutes. The bodies of Jan Kubis and Joseph Gabčík were buried in secret inside of a mass grave within the Dablice Cemetery, and these two are considered today heroes of the Czech people, who managed to take down one of the most evil Nazis. They are interred within the cemetery, and there have been calls to remove their remains and to give them a more dignified and fitting burial place for being heroes of the anti-Nazi resistance. Alongside these two are the remains of many people who had been executed by the Nazis, or who were killed fighting the Nazis in resistance activities. A memorial to these people claims, "At this place during Nazi occupation were buried the remains of patriots who lost their lives fighting for free and democratic Czechoslovakia." Among them are the remains of the heroic paratroopers who on the 27th of May 1942 attempted the assassination of Reich's protector, Governor R. Heydrich. But despite these people being buried who fought the Nazis and the occupation, there are shockingly a number of terrible war criminals and Nazis who are buried within the same cemetery, in the very same consecrated ground. Czech officials at the end of the Second World War brought charges against many men for their horrific crimes, and one of these was the chief of the Order Police, Kurt Daluege. Daluege was responsible for 120,000 active police officials before the Second World War broke out, and he would later claim that he was beloved by 3 million men who worked under him. Daluege was responsible for many war crimes, and he directed the reprisal killings and the razings of the villages of Lidice and Lazaki for the assassination of Heydrich. At the end of the conflict he was arrested and was extradited to Czechoslovakia, where he was then tried for crimes against humanity, and he was unrepentant, and he claimed he was only following Hitler's orders. Daluege was later executed by pole hanging within the walls of Pankrak prison, in front of thousands of people, on the 24th of October 1946, and his body was then quietly buried inside of Dablice Cemetery. Also buried there was another man who terrorised the Czechs, Karl Hermann Frank. Frank was a high-ranking SS official, and was the Minister of State for Bohemia and Moravia. He also took a role in organising the razing of the Czech villages in the aftermath of Heydrich's death, and he was in charge of the Gestapo, SD and Kripo within the Czech lands. He was a ruthless man who aimed to destroy resistance groups and partisan fighters, and his men summarily executed thousands of people. At the end of the war he was too extradited to Prague, and was convicted of war crimes, and was then hanged on the 22nd of May 1946, on the same execution post that Daluege would later be, in front of 5,000 witnesses. His body was then also taken to the Dablice Cemetery, where he was buried in what has been referred to as an anonymous pit or a grave. There are, as mentioned, further people who are interred there, including those who fought the communists after the Second World War, but it is strange that buried inside the very same cemetery and ground as some of the heroes of the anti-Nazi resistance movement are some of the most horrific Nazi war criminals who were executed by the Czechs for their crimes. You would have believed that the Czechs would most probably have wanted to destroy the bones and remains of men such as Karl Hermann Frank and Kurt Daluege, who inflicted so much terror and pain onto the country, but they are still today buried inside of Dablice Cemetery, within the same gates as the men who assassinated Reinhard Heydrich, the Butcher of Prague, Joseph Gabčík and Jan Kubis. Within Dablice Cemetery, heroes of the Second World War, and also Nazi war criminals, and horrific executed men, are buried practically next to each other. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.